So I want to talk to you about authenticity, and I've been a little bit nervous to give this talk because, well, I finished it 8 minutes ago, and I've been preparing it for the last 6 hours that I've looked at my computer. So it's brand new to me, and it's a topic that actually some of you in the audience might know either more about than I do or have different perspectives than I do. But that was actually one of my goals in talking about this topic specifically, which is one that I'm only kind of starting to think about more deeply, which is that we might have some conversations, some discussions about how to develop the tests around authenticity with an SDT kind of approach to them. And so I'll just kind of delve into it and give you a sense of what we have so far around the data that we've collected, and what some of my thinking has been around this. Okay, so first of all, Will Ryan wrote a really amazing paper about this, and so I thought I'd embarrass him by putting his picture up. But essentially, I think some of my thinking around this was after reading Will's paper, Toward a Social Psychology of Authenticity, where he talked about the relationship between autonomy and authenticity. And actually, if you look into the authenticity literature outside of SDT, there's some arguments that you can be authentic in a controlled way. And I'm not going to get quite into that yet, mostly because I don't have data around that. But it might not be the SDT approach to thinking about authenticity. In general, what we tend to see in the SDT literature is that when individuals are autonomy supported in a number of contexts versus being in a more controlling social climate, they feel more genuine or authentic. They report more of these experiences. We see, especially in samples of individuals with stigmatized identities, that when people receive autonomy support, they feel more comfortable to express themselves. They feel less inclined to conceal aspects of themselves that they feel might be met with judgment or criticism. So in general, what we are kind of seeing is that autonomy support fosters this authentic self-expression. And possibly part of that is how we reflect and learn about ourselves as well. And then from the authenticity literature, primarily, we also see that authenticity itself is important for well-being. And so while we tend to, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but when we tend to think about what it means to be autonomous, we tend to think about things like having choices. And also when we measure it, when we operationalize it, we tend to think of having choices. But then alongside that, we tend to measure things like, I can be who I am. I can be authentic. So there are these different aspects of what it means to be autonomous, with authenticity sort of being one of them. And what it looks like is that aspect of autonomy, that being authentic, is in itself important for well-being from these literatures. Okay. So I had a number of questions. One is, are there certain individuals or certain topics that benefit more from autonomy support, from individuals being supported in their autonomy from those in their lives, in terms of their authentic self-expression? The second one was, what sources of autonomy support are important for authentic self-expression? So what I mean here is, are there certain relationships, are there certain individuals in our lives who might make more of a lasting impact? And this question also comes from the fact that authenticity has been looked at as a state measure, but it's also been looked at as a trait measure. People can be more authentic in a lifelong sense, and this is literature outside of SDT. But what it's saying is essentially we can sort of build up a tendency to be authentic. Are there people who help us do that? And the third one was, what forms does authenticity take? So we tend to think broadly of, I can be who I am, but then we also talk about self-concealment, we talk about self-expression, genuineness, all these different characteristics and qualities of authenticity. So what forms does authenticity take? So I started out in terms, when I was thinking about, who benefits more from autonomy support in terms of authenticity, I thought about women for a number of reasons. The first is that I kind of became a bit of a feminist when my daughter Maya was born. This is her riding unsafely on a train that is moving, hanging off the window. And part of me was, how can I help Maya to really be her authentic self? And what does it mean for her to be growing up as a girl and a woman in society today? What are the challenges that she will face in terms of her self-expression? And I found this kind of literature, I guess, a book in more kind of in sociology from Dana Crowley-Jack, who talked about a construct that she called silencing the self. And she said that women tend to do this thing more than men. They tend to silence themselves, especially when it comes to when their own needs and desires are in conflict with those of others around them. So for her, this was a sacrifice that women are socialized to make. This is how she talked about it, that is fundamentally not good for their well-being. And then I found this poster that isn't related to either of those, but I really liked it. Women, know your limits. I thought, oh gosh, what if this is what's going to happen to my Maya? You know, I got to learn more about this. Is this a way that women learn to be, in a way, inauthentic in relationships? So we've been conducting this cross-cultural study that is primarily focused on women, but in some countries we also have data from men with Nikki Legate, Maya Alcuja, my student, and Lenia Matos, as well as other collaborators in different countries. And so we now have data from Turkey, Poland, Peru, UK, well, I said UK twice, UK-centric, Iran, Saudi Arabia, looking at women's experiences. And in these countries, we measured this construct, silencing the self, the way that, that Dana Crowley-Jack had measured it. So she had a number of subscales in her scale. One was this, it's a little confusing, but a subscale within it is called silencing the self. And this is essentially, I inhibit myself if it's going to cause problems. And the idea is that maybe men and women in general inhibit themselves to a greater or lesser extent, but women tend to do it more when it could put them in conflict with others. And then she had another one I thought was fascinating, and it was called care as sacrifice, which basically means in order to love somebody, I have to sacrifice myself for them. And she also kind of theorized that women tend to do this more than men. They tend to see part of their role in a relationship as one of sacrifice. And so what I want to do is kind of look at how these things are endorsed in women in different cultures. And this is just a correlation table essentially across these countries for both of those subscales in relation to the one item from the short BPNS, which is I feel controlled and pressured to be certain ways. And the idea is that maybe those who receive less autonomy support in the sense that they're endorsing I feel controlled and pressured to be certain ways, also tend to do this thing, silencing the self more, also tend to do this thing, care as sacrifice more. And what we see is actually pretty consistent, decent correlations between that item and those scales for silencing the self. In general, women who are endorsing, I feel controlled and pressured to be certain ways, are also saying, I'm willing to shut up if it's gonna cause a problem in my relationships. What I saw is much weaker correlations for care as sacrifice, so we actually still tend to see the control and pressure were related to this feeling that in order to love somebody, I have to sacrifice myself for them. But the relationships were non-significant in some countries and certainly consistently weaker across countries. And so then one of the questions was, do certain people really matter for authenticity? And my first answer is also always family, because you know, we have a lot of exposure to our family in critical developmental periods. So for something like authenticity, where we learn this is you know, my ability to be myself across context, family should really matter. And also, of course, my own personal agenda is just to learn how to be a better parent. So it's all really very egocentric. But you know, here I asked, how does family autonomy support then relate to these qualities of authenticity? And so you're familiar with these kinds of questions in general. My parents try to understand my perspective, reflects more autonomy, supportive parenting. And this was, how true was this for you when you were growing up? So what we saw was I should add one other thing. So we also asked people, I didn't describe this at all, we also asked people how much gender discrimination do they experience in their day-to-day lives. And one of the questions, my personal question was, can autonomy support in a way, family autonomy support, buffer the harmful effects that gender discrimination would have on these sacrifices that women make? And I didn't find evidence for that at all. What we saw instead was that in general, family autonomy support was related to more silencing the self. So that's the blue line. Basically, the blue line being higher than the orange line means that in general, when women came from families that were low in autonomy support, they also endorsed more of silencing the self in their current life. Most of these are young adults. Gender discrimination didn't have an impact at all, and it really didn't moderate this effect. So it really didn't matter whether women experienced it or not. In general, family autonomy support was good. And care sacrifice was even weirder because we did actually see an interaction effect. I didn't bother putting it up, but I wonder if I have a. Oh, I do have. Okay. So sorry, I didn't give you the numbers before, so I didn't quite put it up, but we got an interaction effect here. And what we see is, in general, we don't have a significant effect of family autonomy support on care as sacrifice. And we also don't have a main effect of gender discrimination on care as sacrifice. Instead, we have this interaction where basically when you are high in, when your family provided you a lot of autonomy support, the more discrimination you experience, the more gender discrimination, the less you endorse care as sacrifice. So it's a kind of rebellion towards potentially this gender role. I'm not sure, but it's kind of, the kind of strange thing about it is that the highest group are actually those who have high family autonomy support in low, but experience low gender discrimination. So whereas I thought of care as sacrifice as being something that would be consistently a controlling state, here it's actually associated with more family autonomy support. And then because for me, the why does this matter always comes down to well-being. Does this have an impact on well-being? What I went to see was, would family autonomy support get mediated in its effects on well-being through silencing the self, women silencing the self, and care as sacrifice? And what we see is that family autonomy support is related to lower silencing the self, and silencing the self is related to more women's depression, the way that actually was theorized to begin with, and less life satisfaction. Care as sacrifice was more complicated because it didn't actually relate in this mediational model when it was simultaneous with silencing the self, didn't relate to family autonomy support, and also it actually related to less depression in life, not lower depression. So it was, for well-being, it was a good thing, and not at all with life satisfaction. So we actually see a model where, whereas we think of all this kind of sacrifice as being a women's way of not being true to themselves, it's a little bit more of a complicated model, but silencing the self seems to be the key of where things are at. And then it got even more confusing and upsetting for me because I learned that this wasn't about women at all. So we went in those countries where we had both men and women, what I went to see, well, surely women would be reporting this at higher rates, and surely autonomy support would matter more for them, but neither of those things were true. Actually, men, if anything, were reporting these at higher rates in our samples, at least. So they were the ones who were saying, yes, I silence the self. So we have very, very compromising men in our samples. In both cases, autonomy support mattered in the exact same way. So both, I guess men need autonomy support too, was the unfortunate conclusion I came to. And both partners and family members made a difference. So it was important to receive autonomy support for both in order to kind of feel comfortable being yourself, even in situations where there was conflict. And actually, we saw the same thing for care as sacrifice. Again, men endorsed it more than women, upsettingly for me, and then no interaction effects for autonomy. Everybody had the same kinds of relations. So even though we had those results, so we went on to kind of test these ideas in women in policing. And again, now we know it's not a women's issue, so it sounds really silly. But at the time, I didn't know that, and I was just going with my stereotype from before. So we didn't bother asking men in policing. But we asked women in policing, and the idea was that actually policing is a kind of macho culture where maybe femininity and women's equality might be an issue that merits study. And so we ask the same kinds of questions in women in policing. Generally at work, I don't speak my feelings when I know they'll cause disagreements. and others' needs and feelings conflict with my own, I don't speak my mind. And then instead of looking at family autonomy support, here we wanted to see, well, who's mom and dad in a work climate? It tends to be your supervisor. And so we wanted to see what about autonomy supportive supervisors? Do they help women express themselves more even in difficult, conflictual situations? And we went to look specifically at listening. So we asked questions like, when my supervisor listens to me, he or she doesn't judge me, understands my feelings, and is interested in what I have to say. And what we saw was support for the same kind of model that we saw before. So I asked again the why does it matter question. In policing, we talk about emotional exhaustion as something that is an indicator of poor well-being. It's basically being burnt out, not having the energy to do the job. And as you may know, policing is a very difficult, hands-on, long-hour kind of profession with a lot of risk. So emotional exhaustion is something that people are very vulnerable to. And what we saw, and this was a multi-wave sample. So the first wave was taken at baseline, and then the second one was taken about 4 to 6 weeks later. But what we saw is when you have an autonomy supportive supervisor who when they listened to you was really wanting to support who you are, didn't judge you, wanted to understand you, you actually tended to silence the self a lot less. And as a result, you had, well, it's kind of a little bit, but then we saw silencing the self then led to more emotional exhaustion. So as a result, you would have less emotional exhaustion in this model. And we saw full mediation there was a significant effect of supervisor autonomy, supportive listening on emotional exhaustion 4 to 6 weeks later. So in a way, it was about supervisors allowing women, and probably, if I'm gonna be honest with myself, men, being who they are, that help them to deal with the stresses of the job much better. And then finally, we looked at this within an experimental paradigm, and of course, it's always difficult, well, to kind of assume causation in these correlational models. So what we did here was, again, look at this issue of listening and how people respond to a listener who provides that autonomy support when they're exploring, so that when they're given the opportunity to explore something. And again, I wanted to look at something that would be difficult to explore. So what we did is we looked at exploring a bias. So we asked in a comparison condition, I'd like you to discuss a bias that you have, something that kind of makes you feel uncomfortable, an attitude that you have that you feel is a negative attitude about another group of individuals. And then the other one, we did the same thing, but we kind of enveloped it in autonomy support, and the listener in this case provided some of she designed her own sort of natural autonomy supportive responses that we stayed away from kind of being relationally positive in general, but she provided every once in a while some feedback about perspective taking, demonstrating perspective taking, empathy, and interest. And this is, again, very preliminary. This is all really new data to me, so these are very preliminary t-tests. But looking at the differences between the two conditions, when we ask questions like, this conversation with this person, how much did it give you a chance to express your thoughts and feelings? How much did it let you talk through your important experiences? Having an autonomy supportive listener really helped people feel that they could do those things in a conversation, even with a stranger in this case. And similarly, when we looked at more self-reflection, which is, in some ways, some of the benefit that people get when they can be authentic is it allows them to also explore and understand themselves better. We saw the same effect, helped you to understand yourself better, made you thoughtful about your own experiences. Unfortunately, this last t-test, change your views about your chosen attitude, was not at all significant. So people were feeling they could be more authentic, and they were feeling like they were self-reflective. It didn't really do much for their biases, at least from this measure. But it was at least some benefits of having an autonomy supportive listener in this case. So I asked the questions at the start of my talk. Are there certain individuals or certain topics that benefit more from autonomy support in terms of authentic self-expression? What are the sources of autonomy support that are particularly important for authentic self-expression? And what forms, if we don't think about authenticity as a kind of general concept, but we try to break it down about what that means for different groups in different contexts, what forms could it take? And actually, I think I did a terrible job of answering all of those questions in this talk, because I think we still remain with all of these questions, and I still think that they're useful ones to start to break apart. And I want to add one more that I didn't even begin to try to speak to, which is the resilience question. So if we think about, an adult who is in a context that is controlling, some people are going to respond to that by shutting down, by not self-expressing, by not being genuine. But for some people, they do have, it seems, more of a trait level authenticity. They tend to take their authentic self into different relational experiences, even those that are stressful, controlling, challenging. And so the question is, who are those individuals? What is it about our histories, our personalities, or whatever that allows us to do that, to be ourselves across context? So I think that's a fourth question so now we have 4 unanswered questions that I can leave you with. What I can say from this talk is that the willingness to speak up, this construct, silencing the self, the willingness to speak up, even in difficult situations, can be encouraged by autonomy supportive parents, by supervisors at work, or even experimental manipulations. And although most of these studies were focused on women, actually we can possibly hypothesize the same is true across the board. And this construct, this carrying a sacrifice, is more complicated. I thought it would be universally a detrimental thing, but it clearly wasn't. And I think what it comes down to is that it itself can be genuine and autonomous. It itself can be authentic expressions of what we want to give to others in a relationship, or it can be introjected. And I think if we look at moderation for this construct, it might be more informative than it was in these studies, where it was just the main effect. So I think that is also useful, that kind of how we give up parts of ourselves volitionally in a relationship is a really interesting question to ask in the future. And the book. And more to come, I hope. Thank you.